Hello and welcome to this short video intended to introduce Ray Yang's memoir, Spider Eaters. It's the first-hand account of a woman who grew up in China during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and takes us through some of the very tumultuous events of those decades, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Ray was a participant in, or at least affected by, many of these events, and she and her family offer us an inside view on what life was like in China during those years. I think you'll find it a very gripping account and one that gives us a great way to think about some of these events that we read about in our history textbooks from a very different perspective. My name is Ethan Siegel. I'm an associate professor in the history department at Michigan State University and a specialist in East Asian history. Before going forward, I want to acknowledge the generous support of the Freeman Foundation and of the MSU Asian Studies Center in helping to make this video possible. My copy of Spider Eaters has a cover that looks like the one you see on the image on your screen here. However, I understand there is a newer edition that has come out recently with a cover that looks like this. Whichever edition you have is fine. The content should be the same, and I'm sure you will find it a very powerful account. I look forward to discussing it with you when we get to that point in our Summer Institute. I'll begin the story with the outbreak of World War II in Asia. When full-scale war began between the Japanese and the Chinese, the two leading groups contending for control of China were the nationalists and the communists. I say two leading groups, but in fact it really was not a very even fight at that time, because Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalists, was widely regarded both within and without China as China's leader. He was the inheritor of the very famous nationalist Sun Yat-sen, who had died in 1925. Chiang succeeded him and successfully unified much of the country, about two-thirds of the country perhaps, in the late 1920s under his control. His party was called the Nationalists. The name for it in Chinese is the Kuomintang. You'll see it represented either by the letters GMD, like on the screen, or if it's a different romanization, KMT. They are the same thing. Now, the leading alternative to the nationalists were the communists. You see the photo of a rather young Mao Zedong there on the right. Mao, in fact, didn't become the leader of the communists until the mid-1930s, though he'd always played a key role within the party. At the time of the outbreak of war, the communists were based at a place called Yan'an, a rural location in northern China, a little bit north of the city of Xi'an. They were there in part because it was extremely remote, and they were concerned about attacks from the nationalists. Chiang was obsessed with trying to destroy the communists. He'd sent his armies out to attack them many times, and they had fled from bases farther in the south to this new, more remote location in the north. And that's where they were when war broke out with Japan, starting with the incident at the Marco Polo Bridge in 1937. We often think of World War II as beginning with the German invasion of Poland in 1939, but in Asia it began 2 years earlier. And the responses of these two groups were quite different. Chiang's nationalist government would have seemed to be well prepared to take on the Japanese. It had extensive support from foreign powers. It had control of most of China's cities. It had a large and rich industrial base. And it had military forces that were very, very well trained. And yet, in spite of these seeming advantages, his armies were in fact quite ineffective. Corruption was widespread. Officers were widely regarded to mistreat their recruits. It was difficult to get supplies for the army, and Chiang was thought to be holding back some of his best forces because he preferred to save them for what he anticipated to be a future fight against the communists. Mao's forces, however, although much smaller, not nearly as well supplied, and lacking foreign support, were very effective. They used guerrilla tactics. They enlisted the support of the local population. They, of course, fought on much smaller scale, but they were successful, and as a result, they had better morale, and they were winning the hearts and minds of the Chinese people. And you'll see this reflected in Ray Yang's memoir. She talks about her father, who fought with the communists, who smuggled into Yan'an, bringing medical supplies to the people there, and how passionate and excited he was. With the war's conclusion, the old hostilities between the nationalists and the communists resurfaced. Despite serious efforts by the Americans, you see Hurley in the top image on the left and Marshall in the bottom image on the left, to try to broker a peace between these two sides. That proved impossible. And 2 years after the end of the war, end of World War II that is, civil war in China erupted. Remember, the communists really only controlled the countryside in the north, so it would have seemed that the nationalists were going to win, but in fact they did not. The communists joked that their best arms suppliers were the nationalists, because when nationalist armies were routed, they would flee and leave their weapons and supplies behind, allowing the communists to go stronger as they moved progressively south. By early 1949, it seemed that Jiang had lost the Chinese mainland, and so he and his forces fled to the island of Taiwan that you see there in the red circle. Meanwhile, the communist forces consolidated their position, and in October of 1949, Mao very famously announced China had stood up as he announced the creation of the PRC, the People's Republic of China. This was a chance for Mao and the communists to put into practice many of the policies that they had been writing about, thinking about, and implementing on small scale within their own areas for many, many years. Among their most important goals were eliminating the old society, and by the old society, we're referring to the previous regime and those that came before it, in which small groups of rich or powerful individuals oppressed much larger groups of workers, of peasants, and of poor people, and the like. They wanted instead to forge a new socialist China, one in keeping with the ideals of Marxism, socialism, and in particular Mao's versions of those kinds of thoughts. And they wanted to restore China's position as a leading world power. As we'll learn about during our time together, for much of the last century, China had been bullied about by particularly the Western imperial powers and by Japan, and it had not been a world leading power. Their goal was to turn that around. In terms of more concrete policies, they wanted to empower the peasants and workers. They wanted to help people improve hygiene and literacy. You see in the poster on the right there, a younger girl helping an older woman learn how to read. They wanted to eliminate distinctions based on class and gender. So, for example, one of the policies that they passed, which I certainly think was worthwhile, was equality in marriage law. Women and men were now to be regarded as completely equal in a marital relationship, and both had the opportunity to ask for a divorce. They also wanted to pursue rapid industrialization. Aside from a few urban centers, China was still largely a rural and agricultural society when the communists came to power, and the CCP wanted to change that. But the policy that may strike us as the most ominous was Mao's goal of continuous revolution. Mao believed that any group, once they became the leaders, the elite, if they stayed in that position too long, would become entrenched, that they would begin to abuse power, take advantage of their positions, try to pass things on to children, perhaps, who don't deserve it. So he believed continuous revolution was necessary in order to maintain the goals of a communist society. Women, as we already mentioned, were regarded as equal, at least in official policy, and were able to join the workforce in ways that had never happened in earlier times in China. You see these two posters, one of a woman working with mechanized agriculture, the other of someone involved in construction. And the phrase was, "Women hold up half the sky." Again, we'll see examples of this in Ray Yang's book, where she talks about women working, her own mother working, and later when she goes out to the countryside, the roles of women on the farm and in the workforce there. Mao also, although initially providing land to many formerly poor peasants, promoted policies of collectivization and communes, so much so that by the mid to late 1950s, much of the countryside, people were living on communes where they did not technically own their own land anymore. People had to work together as a unit, and although that might sound like a noble ideal, many in people fact were not all that happy about it. For his part, Mao thought there were problems already less than 10 years into his new administration. His concerns were that production was not rising fast enough, and that people were so concerned with trying to just increase speed or meet quotas that they were not putting in place measures to promote quality or long-term stability. Of greatest concern, perhaps, was he was worried that people at the top were becoming too entrenched. And so he invited criticism, he invited the opinions of people outside of the party in an effort to try to promote improvement within society. The movement was called the 100 Flowers Campaign, and it came from a classical Chinese phrase. The longer version would be something like letting 100 flowers blossom and 100 of schools of thought contend is the right policy for promoting progress in the arts and sciences and a flourishing socialist culture in our land. Well, people took him up on this. People began criticizing local endeavors and criticizing people outside of the party. But as you might imagine, once the floodgates opened, people began not just referring to local events or to ways to improve their factory situation, but began referring to the government officials themselves. And as the criticism became increasingly bold, Mao turned on them. Many important intellectuals and government figures were deposed in the so-called anti-rightist movement. They were labeled with being rightists. Remember, communism and liberal thought is thought to be on the left, so they were labeled as rightists. This campaign was to punish and eliminate such rightists. And so important figures in society, such as the wonderful author Ding Ling or the engineer and official Zhu Rongji, were deposed, served in jail, or had to do hard labor. And of course, this prevented many other people from speaking up, even when criticism was warranted. Even so, this didn't solve Mao's problem. Remember, he wanted to see massive increases in production. And so he launched his most ambitious campaign up to that point, the so-called Great Leap Forward. China was going to very rapidly increase its agricultural output, increase its production of steel and industry, and overtake Western nations. It was going to be a collective effort. People would work together. They would eliminate the 4 pests, which were animals and insects that were thought to hurt people and or destroy the harvest. You'll see references to that in Ray Young's Spider Eaters as well. Open up new agricultural lands, boost agricultural output. They were even going to take metal pots and pans, melt them down, and create steel in backyard furnaces. So you see this illustrated on the poster on the left there, right? The woman holding the sheaves of wheat with the kind of phoenix coming out of them. The man holding the, I don't know what you call it, bucket of steel with a dragon coming out of it, all desired to inspire the people to work harder and realize these goals. As you might imagine, though, this proved to be a disaster. As you might not imagine, it was a disaster of epic proportions. All this melted down metal, you can't just heat up metal and produce steel. It was in fact useless and left people without the pots and pans they needed or without tools to use in the farm fields. The fields, for their part, were often neglected as people focused on a few fields or a few key crops and let the rest of their fields rot, so much so that it led to widespread famine. Agricultural production was overstated because local officials felt they could not disappoint the top leadership. And the famine was so severe that many agree as many as 30 million people may have died during this period of time. That number is staggering. We'll talk more about it during our time together later this summer. The result was even Mao, a figure as beloved as Mao, as widely admired and regarded as Mao, was forced to step back from power. He was not deposed, he didn't lose all of his titles, but he stepped back from taking an active leadership role in governing the country for at least a few years as a result of this. But Mao was not one to sit quietly, and by the early to mid 1960s, he was looking to get back in the game. He launched an even more ambitious program called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which lasted 10 years. And this involved even more turmoil in society. His goal was to, again, bring about revolution, and he was able to do this because people regarded him almost like a god. He had been the person who had finally thrown out the foreign powers, who had unified the country, who had brought equity in many cases to people who had been oppressed for so long. And this allowed there to develop a cult of personality around him, you see in the two images there. This was to be a revolution at the top. He encouraged people to attack their teachers, to attack their parents, and to attack party officials. The goals were to eliminate distinctions in society, distinctions between city people and people in the countryside, between those who did mental work and those who did manual work, between the elites and the peasants. And again, you'll see all of these things illustrated when you read the book. Ray's father, for example, later on, although he was a very well-educated person and had always been an urban person, was basically ordered to go to the countryside and do manual labor on a farm. The idea was that then people from the farms would move into the cities. And there would be this total inversion of society. How was Mao going to bring all of this about? Well, his tool was the youth, the teenagers, who mobilized into groups called the Red Guards. Now this, I'm sure you can appreciate as high school and middle school teachers, must not have been very hard to do because teenagers, as we all know, already have a tendency to want to rebel and to suggest that they might think their teachers or their parents were not operating in their own best interests. Probably didn't take much argument there. They were given tremendous freedom, schools were closed, and they were encouraged to travel about the country, helping to reorganize society along Mao's idea of communism. And you'll read this in the book. Ray becomes one of these Red Guards. She travels by train to the far south. She confronts party officials. She confronts her parents. They are even involved in police type work, challenging anyone and everyone to implement their ideas of what communism and a communist society should look like. However, things quickly get out of hand, and within a year or two, there are conflicts between different Red Guard units. There are unofficial Red Guard units being formed, and these groups are actually, in some cases, fighting each other in the streets. Things get so bad that Mao has to call in the army to help suppress the very Red Guards that he initially encouraged. Now, of course, he has all these very mobilized, very excited youth that he needs something to do with, so they change direction. We enter the second phase of the Cultural Revolution, and during this phase, youth are either encouraged to or are ordered to move to the countryside, to give up their urban residences and to learn from the peasants. Because remember, in this society, the peasants were the ideal. Ray participates in this program. She goes to a place called the Great Northern Wilderness. You'll get to read all about that, where she lives in a very rural and poor farming community. In total, about 17 million youth were involved in this program, some of them sent away for as long as 8 years. And this program only ends when Mao dies in 1976. Well, that I hope gives you a little bit of context for understanding what we'll be reading in Spider Eaters. As with the other two books I've introduced through these videos, I've come up with some discussion questions that I hope you'll take a few minutes to think about as you're doing the reading. Maybe even jot down some answers, not that you'll turn them into me, but that you can refer to when we have discussion. The questions, as you see them here: where do you find evidence of these important historical events we've been talking about in the book? A couple of the characters that you'll meet, Auntie and Second Uncle, what do we learn from their stories? How can we see Mao's goal of continuous revolution being implemented with the very personal stories that Ray Yang gives us? There is a series of questions about Ray's experience as a Red Guard and how she, at least according to her own memoir, she says she came to question the validity of what they were doing. There's also a set of questions about life for Ray in the Great Northern Wilderness. And finally, what can we learn big picture about the Cultural Revolution, and what should we doubt from Ray Yang's memoir? As I said, I know you'll find this book very interesting. My students always have in the past. I look forward to discussing it with you. Of course, bring questions of your own as well. Thank you very much.